Welcome, everyone. My name is Peter Hook. I'm the Director and Associate Dean of the Law Library, and it's my pleasure today to host a panel talking about the production of scholarship aided by generative artificial intelligence for legal academics, but it also has an impact on the legal journal world and like what students might need to know to get in front of AI assisted scholarship. But with me today in person is Andrew Torrence, who's a law professor at the University of Kansas. He works in the areas of patent law, intellectual property, biotechnology law, bio law, empirical and big data, investigations of legal topics. And additionally, and this will be relevant for today's conversation, he has a PhD in biology from Harvard, where he did a genetic analysis of the rodent families of Australia. And you'll see why that's relevant later. Joining us on Zoom is his close friend and frequent co-author, Bill Tomlinson. Bill Tomlinson's on this a professor of informatics and education at the University of California, Irvine. If you're not familiar with the term informatics, it's kind of the computer science plus the socio-technical aspects of things technology. He writes on the use of artificial intelligence and other information technologies to foster smart communities and hopefully sustainable communities. He's written a book on greening through information technology. He has a PhD from the MIT Media Labs, where he investigated synthetic social relationships and computational entities back in 2002. So both of our illustrious speakers today have been living this world for quite some time. And the two of them came to my attention because they were the feature of an ABA Journal article that talked about a special edition of the Texas A&M Journal of Property, in which Andrew and Bill used AI, and we'll talk about that process and the responsible use and the guardrails that come with that, to generate 4 academic law review articles. And then the students themselves wrote an intro and talked about pressing issues that student journals are going to have to face in the world of AI. Those 4 special articles, and you'll see the bio theme, were on invasive species, the how of biodiversity laws, over harvesting, the why of biodiversity laws, pollution, the what of biodiversity laws, as well as population, the who of biodiversity laws. I have them with me. They're look like any other law reviews I've seen. And with that, why don't we turn to Andrew and Bill to talk about how that came about. I've had the pleasure in prepping for this discussion to see they had written previously on and explicitly about how to best go about producing academic legal scholarship using AI.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Thanks, Kevin, and thank you very much for this very warm welcome. None of you probably know this except the folks that had dinner with me last night, but this is one of my favorite law schools, possibly my favorite in the whole country, and that includes the place that I got my law degree at. From a very, very early stage of my career, Washington University invited me to come to a junior scholar event, and Dean Collins was also there. And since then, I've been invited to a number of events that have really helped me as a scholar, and I think in some ways have shown me sort of the model of what a law school could be, not just as a place where students learn, but as a place where scholarship can be fostered. So I'm really love this place. I'm delighted to be back. Bill might have a different view of how this all started, but I'll give you my view, and then I think we'll let Bill give his version, which is probably more accurate than mine. Bill and I have known each other for a long time. We have a lot of interests in common. In fact, there's just about no interests that we don't find interesting, and we have all of those in common. So we love talking about all sorts of things, and conversations between the two of us often rabbit hole in and out of all sorts of topics. We ended up having a sort of a weekly phone call starting about 3 years ago, in which we discuss what we might want to do together. We'd done a few papers together, but we thought if we get together weekly, we can bat around ideas that we have, and maybe it will lead to projects, or maybe just have fun discussions. And at the time that sort of the prehistory of ChatGPT. So this is back when it was just GPT, and I think it was probably GPT 2 or 3, so it's 2002. Midjourney was really where the action was, because with Midjourney, you could make these funky visualizations of things that often came out really weird. So this is like dogs with 3 heads, or, you know, people with 7 fingers. I know this still happens with the visualization software, but Bill and I both thought, wouldn't it be fascinating to talk to artists who do art for their livelihood and ask them, how is this affecting, or how is it going to affect their careers? So we sort of came up with a protocol. We gathered a list of artists to talk to. And my recollection of it is that the first couple of people we talked to, our question would start like, you know, in general, how do you feel about these visualization softwares? And each person said, well, my career's over. And we'd laugh nervously and say, oh, that's, you know, that's funny. And they say, no, my career's over. I can't sell my work anymore. I'm going to have to move into another field, because even though these versions are terrible, they do it so cheaply and so quickly, I can't keep up. And I think we abandoned that project pretty quickly, because we thought it would be a very depressing paper and pretty short too. You know, Midjourney has killed professional art. These weren't, you know, Van Gogh style painters. These were journeymen, people that you know, take commissions, do illustrations for books, for advertisements, et cetera. So we had to sort of shift our attention away from that as an academic topic, because clearly there was nothing there. Now, obviously that's not true. Lots and lots of interesting developments even today. But we started talking more and more about AI, and Bill was really my guide. Bill understands this stuff at a far higher level than I do, but the timing was almost perfect, because by the fall of, it was either fall of 2022 or early 2023, GPT had become available in a form that anybody could access. And I started playing with it. I know that Bill started playing with it. And in one of our conversations, I made a joke about how we hadn't written anything together for a while, and that I was feeling really unproductive, at least vis-a-vis our collaboration. And Bill, whose nickname is the Badger, I hope that's okay, Bill, and whose specialty is to gently badger you to get things done. He's a fantastic person to collaborate with, because every time you start to lag, you'll get a friendly little text saying, have you finished the abstract? Did you look at the edits from whatever? So Bill said, in typical Bill style, well, why don't we use GPT to write a paper? And I thought, oh, yeah, that's such a great idea. And I just sort of, you know, I thought that's a great idea, and moved on to a different topic. He said, no, really, why don't we do an experiment? Why don't we see if we can actually write an academic paper using this relatively rudimentary version of you know, we're now up to GPT-5 and the other models. I'll typically just reference the OpenAI ones, but we also use, of course, the Anthropic models, Gemini. We don't really use the Grok ones very much, because I feel that they're tremendously powerful, but they lack guardrails in a very obvious way that I think worries both me and Bill as to the results. So we stick with the, you know, the classic ones. But Bill said, no, I'm serious. Why don't we write a paper? So we sat down and deliberately planned how you would go about writing a paper with, I think it was GPT 3 or 3.5. Yeah. And we just had all these theories about how it might work. We didn't trust it, of course. We thought, oh, it's going to do a terrible job. It's not going to do anything that we don't tell it to do. We ended up coming up with, I think, sort of a rudimentary outline of what we wanted to talk about, and points that were essential to touch on, and maybe some references that we knew about, some arguments that we had to parry. and sort of a structure, structure of where different things would be addressed. But I don't think it was more than 1 or 2 pages for the first time we did this. And Bill took that and he rendered it. That's what we call the process. Bill rendered it. And unbelievably, within a short period of time, like 10 minutes, we had a beefy article. And we both read it. We tried to scrutinize it. We tried to figure out whether there's anything good there. And I know that I was overwhelmed by how astonishingly good it was compared to what I expected. And maybe I'll turn it over to Bill. And Bill, why don't you sort of give your version of the story of how we did the beginning processes of the first rendering. I'm sure you have a different perspective, probably more technical, and feel free to throw that in.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. So Andrew and I have been working together for decades, and it's a wonderful collaboration. Andrew is an incredible source of ideas, which is very exciting, and it's really neat to chat with him. And one of the challenges in working with Andrew is like, yeah, we should write that one up, and oh yeah, we should write that one up, and yeah, we should write that one up. And it becomes challenging because there's so many interesting ideas to pursue. And so sort of fast forward to December 2022.
Right.
One of my friends was sick, and I think he may have had COVID or something, and he was posting all of these weird pictures to Facebook. And I was like, I too would like to post weird pictures to Facebook. And so I went and learned about Midjourney and was like, wow, you can really make weird pictures, not too difficultly, or without too much difficulty. And so that then got me into the space of generative AI for language as well. And so yes, as Andrew mentioned, we had these ideas, and I was like, oh, let's try to write a paper together. And the thing that for me is the most powerful transformation of the scholarly process is using ChatGPT turns the process from needing to produce appropriate content, into identifying good content. And so, ChatGPT is still not incredibly brilliant at all things. It's getting much better, and it's very good in lots of domains, but especially in 2023, early 2023, it was able to put sentences together, but it wasn't a super genius. But what it could do is I could say, okay, write me a paragraph about this sentence, and it would turn my sentence into a paragraph. And then I'd be like, no, not like that. That wasn't it. And then I'd say, no, like this. And, then it would change. And so Andrew and I would go back and forth and look at the draft and say, no, this whole section needs to be changed. In a way that if we had a human collaborator, they would have become frustrated with us because it was changing. We were changing things so rapidly and discarding things so cavalierly that any human that was engaged in that process would have been thoroughly off-put by the rapidity of iteration as we went through these ideas. But it became a really neat kind of scavenger hunt through the space of what we were thinking about to have a way to turn a half-baked idea into a page and be like, well, is this the page that I meant, or was this page garbage? And say, no, well, it's sort of like that, and then would change directions and write up the specification a little bit differently. And so it became a really powerful iterative way to explore these ideas, to hill climb toward what it was that we were trying to do together. And in many ways, it became a third collaborator. The same way that Andrew would say something and I'd be like, oh, that's neat. Have you thought about blah? And then I'd say, oh, how about this? And Andrew would be like, oh, that's neat. Have you thought about blah? That now we were able to be like, oh, ChatGPT, will you write us a page on that and allow us to determine whether or not that was even sort of what we meant. Sometimes seeing something, reduced to paper changes your perspective on it. And so Andrew and I, over the last I don't know, 2.5 years, I guess, have produced quite a few papers in various different versions of our process. And we've also written several papers about our process because we feel like it has been a useful learning experience.
Bill, let me That's a good segue. Let's talk about the SMU paper where you have your 7 protocol steps. So your recommendations. And before we do that, let me mention one of our guests in Legal Tech Week was Andrew Perlman, Dean at Suffolk, and he mentioned the same thing you did, that he's found the generative AI as a great productivity enhancer. Like if you have the kernel of an idea, you can put out a lot more scholarship because the battle is joined in terms of getting the basic writing underway, and then you can formally polish it as you go. And so he's ultimately more productive as a scholar utilizing generative artificial intelligence. So with that, let's segue to and I wasn't aware of it till I was reviewing yesterday, and and prior to the Texas A&M special issue journal, you had published in Southern Methodist University's forum, your 7 protocols to your recommendations about how you go about drafting scholarship as legal academics.
This is the ChatGPT and Work Scholarly. Okay, so I can't resist telling you that the origin of that title was very contentious. I tend to be the title person. I like stupid puns. If you like The Economist magazine, almost every headline is a double entendre. I love trying to do that. I don't claim that I do it well, but I do love trying. So for that, I just thought, oh, ChatGPT and Work Scholarly, it sounds a little bit like Gilbert and Sullivan. I sort of like that. And we've reached the stage, Peter, where we'd submitted enough papers, I think maybe 3. And we realized that this experiment was actually, teaching us things about the process as we iterated, that maybe we should share a little bit of our insights, even at that early stage. So ChatGPT and Work Scholarly, I said, why don't we call it that? And Bill said, that is the stupidest title. There's no way we are ever going to use that title. And I said, why? I thought it was weird that he reacted so violently against it. And it came out pretty quickly in my withering cross-examination that he hates Gilbert and Sullivan, just hates them with a passion.
No, wait. No, I'm feeling impugned. My problem with it was that it was ChatGPT and Work Scholarly. It was putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. I didn't like the cadence. I'm perfectly comfortable with the modern major general and whatnot.
I think there's some revisionist history going on here because there's more to the story, which is I parried with Bill a little bit about this, and he said one of the reasons we can't name it this is that nobody under the age of 60 cares about Gilbert and Sullivan. Remember that?
True. That's true.
Okay, that's true.
Right. You're right.
And this is one of these moments of serendipity that you can't even write about in fiction. Suddenly, as we're talking about this, my daughter, who was at the University of Chicago and who loves drama, texts me a photograph. What is it? It's her and her friend sitting in the audience of HMS Pinafore. And she said, guess where we are? And I guessed that it was a Gilbert and Sullivan, and Bill is Uncle Bill to my daughter Honor. And I said, well, here's what your niece Honor is doing right now. She's at Gilbert and Sullivan. And so I think Bill he conceded that we had to name it that. Yeah. So the point of the article was we tried to distill down the things that we thought were absolutely necessary in our process. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't more steps that other people might want to add. And it also doesn't mean that, with better thought than we were engaging in, you might be able to boil it down to fewer steps. But the first thing, and this might vary a little bit from ChatGPT, and I'm hoping by the end of this, we might have like 1 minute. I asked just before the lecture, just as an exhibit, as an example, I asked ChatGPT to take our article and to rewrite it and update it with all of the literature that's come out since we published it. So it's churning away right now, and it might have even a different title by the end of this session. But the first thing we do is we think of the ideas. So there's the sort of the ideation phase, and we try and make sure that the idea is interesting, that it hasn't been done to death by other people or done perfectly by somebody else, that there's some importance to it, that it resonates with both of us. And then what we do is we outline. So we write an abstract, a really, really beefy abstract. And sometimes what we've done is I've given sort of an outline to one of my RAs. And at times, I've had teams of more than 20 RAs working for me in the past couple of years, just on these projects, just to make sure that everything is checked and rechecked. So what I would do is I would give sort of a skeleton outline to an RA, and I would ask them to find all of the literature that's relevant to each of the points in the skeleton outline. And for the biodiversity papers, we benefited hugely because I had this wonderful RA who spent all summer working on outlines, and her outlines were probably 20 pages long and included literature reviews of everything. And we would feed that in with the query. We'd say, please follow the outline. So we've got the outlining phase. So then the query part is really crucial. I think there's a sort of a two schools of philosophy right now, or two philosophies, I should say, schools of philosophy. One is that don't worry about the query, it'll figure it out. The other is, unless you get exactly the right query, you're not going to get what you want. I think we probably fall in between. You need to kind of get it off in the right direction, but it will increasingly fill in the spaces that you don't specify, which is very comforting. So you need to craft the query, and the query takes advantage of the fact you've got a beefy abstract, an outline, the arguments that you think are absolutely necessary, hopefully a literature review, although it will fill in that as well and add additional literature to it. And then you have to specify things like do it in Blue Book style. So, make sure that the footnotes are in Blue Book style. Now, we publish in a variety of different outlets, including non-legal journals, where it's usually author, space, year. So you have to specify like Chicago style, Blue Book, or recently I was working on an article which was Psychology and Human Evolution, and it had a very particular citation style. So you really need to specify that, because otherwise what you get is you get a draft that you have to unpick. You have to unpick it, like pull the threads all the way out in order to make the references make sense. And then when we first started, we were rendering little bits and pieces, in part because of technical constraints and memory constraints, if I'm remembering right, Bill.
Yep.
But at this point, you can render an entire paper on ChatGPT-5, and it's pretty darn good. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. And it can be really big too. You can do 50, 60 page law reviews. So I think over the years, the last 3 years, experimenting with doing larger chunks of rendering, including full chunks, full papers. So then comes the real labor, which is you have to rip it to shreds. You have to read every sentence. You have to read every reference. You have to make sure that it's saying what you meant it to say. You have to add sentences of your own, entire paragraphs. You have to rip out sections that make no sense. And sometimes we had some trouble with the biodiversity papers. There was one in particular, I forget which one it was, population. So the biodiversity papers are a cycle that we did as an experiment. E.O. Wilson, who was my PhD advisor when I started at Harvard, he had a mnemonic device called HIPPO, which stands for the 5 leading causes of biodiversity loss, which is habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution, overpopulation, which is a cheat because you call it population, and then overexploitation, which is another cheat. But it ends up being HIPPO, which is cute and you can easy to remember. So it rendered the other ones just fine, but it just kept choking on population. And it really wanted to go off on tangents on population that neither Bill nor I were comfortable with, nor had we given it any sort of instruction, to go off script. So we had to just query and re-query and edit and re-edit to force that one back into what we wanted. So at that point, you're not done. You've done sort of the first intensive edit. And I set my research assistants loose on this as well. What I say to them is the same I say when I write papers with no assistance from AI. So I want to make sure that every single sentence makes sense and that every single sentence that makes a factual assertion has some sort of citation that stands for that factual assertion. The same kind of thing that journal editors would insist upon. Especially 2 years ago, there were lots of changes that needed to be made. There were miscitations, there were hallucinations, there were bizarre connections that maybe they were the right connection, but neither Bill could understand nor I could understand them. So once you go through that, then we would put it through Turnitin. So, and there's a variety of different softwares you can use. Turnitin, I think we use because it's free at our universities. Pardon me. What Turnitin does is it uses a gigantic database to try and match your text with existing published text. So why do you do it? Well, we do it because from the very beginning, we say this in the ChatGPT paper, we were worried about our reputations as scholars. We were doing an experiment. We thought it was a valuable experiment, and we were upfront about it. The very first footnote in all of our papers says, here is exactly how we wrote this paper. Here's exactly how we used ChatGPT. And in fact, we tried, didn't we, Bill, to get ChatGPT listed as a co-author?
Yeah.
And almost universally, journals say, no, it's not an author. We disagree. We think it's an author, and increasingly so. But we had all these arguments with journals, not just scientific journals. We argued with Nature over that scientific reports paper, remember? We were going to list ChatGPT as a co-author. They said we simply have an absolute policy that we will not mention an AI. So instead, what we do is we explain the method like it's a scientific paper. And we want that to be front and center, in part because we want people to know that this was done with AI. Also, we want the journals to make a decision right up front, because a couple of times we submitted to a journal, they said, we love this paper. We'd like to run it in the special issue. This happened at one of the California universities. We were really pleased to get the acceptance. And then they said, oh, we just noticed that you used AI. I sort of thought, you just noticed? It's the first footnote. Like, I don't know what you were looking at. And then they went up the chain to the chancellor at this university to see if they could get the policy varied. And the chancellor said, heck no, nothing with AI. And so they couldn't publish the paper. Now, interestingly, Bill reminded me last night that this same university, and I won't mention which one it is. It's a good one. They said recently, do you still have that paper? And we said, we still do. Said, we'd like to publish. And we said, you know, it's radioactive, right? They said, yeah, but our new policy towards AI radioactivity is we accept it as long as you mention it. So
wonderful. I mean,
let me
Yep.
just too quick. I know I'm rambling, but two other steps. So once we get through the plagiarism check, 2 years ago, that was a huge thing. And in fact, Bill and I did not enjoy this part because it took sometimes an entire day to wade through all of the similarities. And so we needed to excise all of that. And we did. We took the time to do it, but it was really laborious. After that, what we do is we look for hallucinations. And we did that a little bit too when the RAs go through it, but occasionally there's just stuff that doesn't make sense. Sometimes it's stuff that I wrote and it just doesn't make sense to me. Other times it's stuff that came from the AI that doesn't make sense. We want that, we want to get rid of that so that everything makes sense. And then we would run it through the RA process again. And then I think we used to do 2 Turnitins, didn't we? We do a final Turnitin at the end to make sure that we had not infringed anybody's copyright and not plagiarized anybody's work inadvertently. Now that process has become telescoped now because the new versions of ChatGPT, they generally do not plagiarize according to what we've found. And they don't hallucinate very often. So all of that's been squeezed down into a tiny minority of what you end up in the paper. And then we submit with that beefy first footnote that like a neon sign in Vegas, it says, beware, this contains AI. And let me say one other final little thing. One of the papers we wrote about a year into this process was, I forget the exact title. It's on the slides, but it's like organic websites. And what we thought was, this is going to be a big problem. People are not going to know whether they're reading AI generated stuff, human generated stuff, or hybrid. So I teach food and drug law sometimes. I thought, why not come up with a sort of organic certification mark where if it's fully human generated, sort of an artisanal website or paper, then you could get a certification that says this is thoroughly human. If it's quasi, part AI and part human, then it could be sort of, the second category. And if it was all machine all the time, then it would get a different certification. And we thought this would not only be useful for full disclosure before people decided to read or trust scholarship. But it would also be useful in searching because you could constrain your search to only fully human artisanal scholarship, or you could broaden the search to include quasi, or you could just drop the constraints and search for everything. So over to you, Peter, sorry.
No problem. Thank you. So it doesn't really come out in the ABA Journal article how much subject expertise went in at the very creation. So one of the themes of Legal Tech Week is, the importance of some kind of human in the loop. I've seen that demonstrated a lot more than initially comes out in the gloss of the process. Let's start it from the perspective of student journals. And you can kind of relate the experience you had with the Texas A&M journal editors. What should editors, so law is unique in that our scholarship tends to be student-led, not peer-reviewed, student-selected. But what should students on journals at law schools, how should they get in front of the coming wave of AI scholarship?
Bill, I've blathered on. Do you want to start this or do you want me to? It's up to you.
So I have one comment on something you said previously that I wouldn't mind saying, but then I'd be happy to turn it back over to you because I have not been to law school. I've not been a journal editor and I don't know anything about it aside from having written a few papers there. But one interesting question, this is with regard to the organic certification, that there was a book a sci-fi book I was reading a little bit ago, and it was talking about how getting permission, this was set 20 years in the future, getting insurance to drive your own car was exceedingly expensive because having a computer drive your car was obviously the safe way to do it, and you needed to pay through the nose if you wanted to have the privilege of driving yourself around. At some point, I expect that AI systems will be far superior to humans at doing citations, and I see no reason to resist the process of handing over that responsibility. I don't think it's ready yet, but I think over the next decade, I think it will become potentially better than humans at understanding where citations should go, understanding whether or not this is a reasonable citation for this slot. So I think while there is there's a great deal of resistance in various different in people's, I don't know, in people's spirit. Some people are very resistant to it. It doesn't feel like it's a logical sentiment. That I think that will gradually yield as resistance to all sorts of technology yields over time, typically. And students are in a position where they probably, because they are younger and more cognitively malleable and amenable to new things, will be less resistant than older people typically will be. But yeah, Andrew, I'll turn it over to you for the law review point because you know more about that than I do.
Sure. Okay. So I'll start with the Texas A&M Journal. We had this cycle of biodiversity papers. There was a sort of an overarching paper, and then there were the 5 individual components of HIPPO. And we submitted them fairly widely, and we got some early acceptances. And I forget which ones were accepted, but it was like the H was accepted very early, and the general paper, the explanation paper was accepted. And then we got this wonderful email from the Texas A&M Journal of Property Law saying, we want them all. We want all of your articles. We want to do a special issue with all of your HIPPO articles. And Bill and I both felt so like we really wanted to give them all of the articles, but we couldn't because we'd already given them to other journals. And we didn't want to have the conversation about, oh, we're going to pluck it from you and give it to somebody else. So they ended up getting 4 out of the 6. But these journal editors, they decided that they wanted to use this as a way to tweak the method by which law review articles are written and the acceptance of articles that are written with the help of AI or even just by AI. But I think they're mostly, in their principles, they're mostly talking about with the help of AI. So they decided they would write their own law review article as a sort of intro to the special issue that would use our articles as examples of using AI and then pull out, generalize some principles, abstract some principles that they thought that would be useful to other journal editors. And I think they're extremely useful. Essentially, it's a sort of a set of tiers from, it's similar to our organic thing, but more detailed where, no AI usage whatsoever, a little bit, even more, hybrid, quite a bit, and complete use of AI. And they, I don't want to simplify what they wrote about because they wrote this whole sort of how-to article, but their article very thoughtfully talks about the effects on law review journals and on editors. And it talks about reputational issues. Like you really have to be careful with this stuff because let's face it, there are articles out there which are almost completely written by AI and the authors have not said so. And not just in law, but in other, we're finding this all over the place in the scientific literature. And in fact, I saw a scientist the other day defending a paper that he had submitted by saying, well, it wrote it better than I ever could. So why would I write it myself? And why does the world need to know how it was written? It's correct. But I think that people feel queasy because they didn't know the provenance of the method by which it was written. But so this Texas A&M article is great. It doesn't line up exactly, I'd say, with my experience and Bill's experience, but I think that it collects all of the issues that you would need to think about as a student journal editor, and frankly, as a faculty member submitting to a journal, so that you're fully informed of the implications of using AI to any extent, from very little to a lot. And really, I applaud those editors. We've stayed in touch. I don't know if Bill knows, but all of the editors got good jobs. So I stayed in touch. I said, let me know whether you've gotten jobs, if you need somebody to write a letter or call, make a phone call. So they've all gotten jobs, which is fantastic. But I just loved the fact that these guys went above and beyond to sort of draw the path for others of how you might deal with this issue. And very much like Bill just said, their philosophy of this is, it's coming and it's sort of here already, so let's do it right. And I think that that's largely Bill's and my attitude as well. Bill's probably more of an even faster adopter than I am, but I'm the kind of person that when I first saw a Waymo in San Francisco, I thought, I want to ride in that car. And I will now not take Uber. I will not drive on anything but Waymo in San Francisco. I love it. And other people are pretty leery of getting into a car with no driver. This is a little bit like, a law review article with no writer. Bill, yeah.
So I'll say this in half seriousness and half in jest, but I will offer advice to everybody in the room that one of the most wonderful things about when you want to write with AI, make sure that one of your co-authors is a world-class intellectual property professor, because it makes it very relaxing, because I don't have to worry about the IP issues, because if Andrew is satisfied with it, I know it's going to be okay. And so that has been part of what has enabled this. I've been an academic for 25 years. I might not have been as willing to forge ahead in this domain if I weren't doing it with somebody who is an expert in exactly the topic that we were going to be taken task for if we were going to be taken to task. So this has only really been possible because of Andrew's expertise in this domain.
Let give me 30 seconds. I apologize, Peter. We got in trouble, by the way. We drafted an article, and we used AI to help us, right?
Yeah.
So we drafted an article, submitted to a scientific journal, and it went to peer review. 2 of the 3 peer reviews were very positive, said you should publish this right away. The third said, these guys are the worst plagiarists that I've ever seen. And not only should we not publish this article, but this journal needs to take it upon itself to force them to talk to the chancellor of their university and basically to turn themselves in. So Bill called me in a tizzy about this. I said, first of all, we didn't plagiarize, so don't worry. So let's figure out what the problem is. It turned out that we submitted a draft of the article to Turnitin so that it would be in its database. And this guy used Turnitin in our article. And he found an exact one-to-one match of an article to the thing is, we wrote back to the journal editor. We said, ask reviewer number 3 to see if there's any author names at the top of the allegedly plagiarized article. And then the guy basically resigned from being the 3rd reviewer because he hadn't noticed it was our article. It was our names at the top. So by being assiduously careful, we got nailed. And for about 5 minutes, I think both Bill and I thought this is really bad.
I was very concerned.
So let's expand a little bit, because I'm confident, like we've seen with chess, algorithmic chess has developed moves that humans never thought of. Same with other games, Go, same with protein folding, which recently won the Nobel Prize. So I'm convinced, and others have long before I have written about this in the information science literature, that algorithms and computers are going to draw inferences from existing literatures, put things together that humans have yet to do. So there will be innovations through a kind of an algorithmic harvesting of the literature, and whether set in motion by an author, a corporation, an entity. What do we make of these algorithmic discovered connections? Do we have them attributed to individual authors who start the process? Do we have them in the commons for, like open, free and open to everyone to use? And your background in particular could speak to that, Bill.
Yeah. So Andrew and I wrote one of our papers was the title was Late Binding Scholarship, and it doesn't go quite as far as the point that you just made, but it's sort of a first step there. That right now, when a person writes a law review article, it is fully reduced to text. You have 40 pages or whatever of text, and if somebody reads that 100 years from now, it's going to be the exact same 40 pages of text. And that is useful for historical reasons, but I would argue that probably most legal scholarship from 100 years ago, it might have differences from what you would consider to be first-class legal scholarship right now. So what our paper proposed is that rather than writing a finished paper and being like, this is a fully articulated version of our scholarship, instead, what you can say is, this is our core principle, and this is the abstract as we understand it now, and these are the 50 or 100 scholarly citations that we see connecting, and this is how we see them connecting to this point. But then, 5 years from now, you could imagine that you could say, okay, re-render this paper, take the same ideas, but enhance it with the scholarship that has happened in the past 5 years, enhance it with any addenda that the authors may have made as they had revisions to their principles, draft it for a particular audience. You might want a version of this paper that's written for 10-year-olds. You might want a version of this paper that's written for retirees. There could be all sorts of different audiences. You may want it for a law professor, but you only want one paragraph right now because that's all the time you have to read it. You don't need 40 pages. And so the idea of encapsulating the concepts with a body of work and guidance for how to integrate new work into it would allow for this continuously evolving scholarship that could, I think, point to the towards the future that you articulated of a future where AI, hopefully in consultation with humans, is coming up with a core set of ideas and then deciding, okay, here are the problems of our time. How can we bring together, how can we bring to bear all of the other ideas that have been had by humans and computational systems to address these issues and come up with more suitable ways to move forward, ways to optimize our society for how we would like it to be.
So I suspect in the interim, Andrew is consulting his laptop and seeing the update of one of your papers that had just run.
Yeah, I started this just before I walked over from the Knight Center. I don't know whether it's good. I haven't read it, but it's 53 pages single spaced. It's 30,000 words, and it's an update. It appears to be an update exactly as I asked it, at a sort of a law professor or academic or social science professor level, and it has something like 132 more references. Now, again, I don't know whether it's good or bad, but it's an example of what Bill's talking about. This is our ChatGPT article updated for right now. And it probably was done long before we started this session. But to me, that's really valuable because the points we made there, I'm sure are different now. And I'm sure there's more points. And I would not like to be frozen in time like a fossil. I'd love the ideas to continue evolving and to maintain their value.
And I think we're at a good point to stop. The reason the phones are out is they're registering their attendance for promotional purposes or get a sweatshirt. But let's turn it over if there are any burning questions from the audience. If not, we have someone's got one here.
Sure. So 10 years from now, how are we determining who's like actually a luminary in the field of legal scholarship when potentially a layman could just, in a one paragraph prompt, write the next flagship law review article?
Do you have a book by Clay Shirky called Here Comes Everyone?
It may be that we've democratized the process of legal academics, and anybody can potentially, with the help of technology, make a useful contribution to legal scholarship. How do we determine the luminaries? Boy, is that a thorny question. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe we have to test them in a room with no electronics or something. I have no idea how they do that in 10 years. Fantastic question. But is it a problem, is what I would say in return. Is it a problem that everybody has at their fingertips the ability to make highly articulate arguments and to acquire expertise that they don't naturally have or might not even be able to gain with education? Your question reminds me of this experiment that was done by Ethan Mollick and Kareem Lakhani. Kareem is a fantastic writer about AI who's at Harvard Business School, and Ethan Mollick has written a book called Co-Intelligence that I recommend everybody take a look at. It's just really clever. They did this study, I think it was at Boston Consulting Group, where they gave access to the same version of OpenAI. It seems like you're familiar with this. And what they found was that the high performers, the people who had already been judged as high performing consultants, they were able to increase the quality of their work a little bit, but the laggards, the really bad performers, were able to pull themselves up massively compared to the really good ones. So they didn't quite reach the level of the top performers. Now, some people's reaction to this study was, oh, that's cheating. You know, those people who were really good before, now they don't seem quite as good, but they should be because, somehow they were the high. But another way to look at it is that BCG is paying all of these people to be productive. And some people already are productive and some people aren't, but the ones who aren't now are productive. So it seems like it's like a surplus of benefit to society. So I sort of dodged your question. I don't know, but I'm not sure it's a problem.
I mean, we were told that it was important to have an expert like you in writing these articles in the first place.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't think of myself as an expert.
I think of myself as an enthusiast. And I hope I'll continue to be enthusiastic, but wouldn't it be great if anybody who is enthusiastic about a topic could make a contribution to it?
Ooh, I have an answer. Is it okay?
Go.
Can I have a turn?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I feel like I have a potential answer to your question. So over the last couple hundred years, science has undergone a transition. And that transition has been where 200 years ago, the hard part of being a scientist was getting access to other things that had been written. When Charles Darwin was being a scientist, like the tricky bit was that somebody else might be studying a different species, some other part of the world, and like, how are you going to learn what they had to say? How would you get their article into your hands? Now, the hard part of being a scientist is filtering. There is arbitrarily much scholarship that you could apply to your work from a variety of different fields. And that's getting worse every day as more and more content gets produced by AI. So really, I see who are the experts as the ones who are the effective filters. Andrew has name-checked a number of people, Ethan Mollick and others, in his discussion. And that is because Andrew has found value in the filtering that they are doing. And so, you know, yes, on the one hand, one of the ways you used to be able to identify an effective filter is that they had the letters PhD at the end of their name or ESQ at the end of their name. And that was like, oh, this is a person with expertise. They're probably a good filter. It is right that like maybe a good filter is going to be a 17-year-old who is devoting, you know, 22 hours a day to poring over the legal scholarship, and is a world expert in this one really narrow thing. And you will then have filters of filters. You'll have some PhD who's like, oh, let me put you in touch with the 27, 17-year-olds who are their respective experts on these weird little topics. And so I think that will become the mechanism by which you get to know what the good scholarship is and who the good people are in these domains. They're the people who know which, you know, which texts in the Library of Babel to point to.
Any other questions from the audience? I know some have to go to 1 o'clock classes. Bill, for your benefit, there's about 60 people in the room. We were told there might be hundreds of people online. If there aren't any additional questions, maybe this is a good point to end and thank our speakers both. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.